So, okay, let's get on with this shindig. I'm going to kind of show you some stuff real quick to let you know where it came from, or at least how I got interested in this. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was at a world conference in Tennessee. It was on a subject, how do we improve the statistics in addiction treatment? And I walked into one class as well as, many other practitioners, and they showed this new science that was literally mind-blowing, and I was having a spiritual experience. I was shaking. My eyes were as big as teacups. My jaw was probably on my chest. My tongue was rolling out like a carpet or something, and I just had to get back to West Palm Beach and put this stuff together and put it into my one of my classes that I do at the treatment center. And it is, since that time, for about 4 or 5 years, continued to touch the hearts and lives of other people suffering through addiction. So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you today. And if I could have the next slide, that would be cool. I call it the brain a terrible thing to waste. I thought you might like that. Interesting. We talked earlier this morning about this spirit, soul, and body thing, and we're going to talk a little bit more on that. But like I said, we're going to go into this new technology. So if I can go to the next slide, we opened up these 3 issues, if you remember. Remember the new stuff, the neuroadaptation, the cellular memory, the homeostasis? Well, we're going to talk about the brain being that part of the body. Remember, Paul talks in the 7th chapter of Romans. He says, I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my sinful nature. And that sinful nature that he's talking about is his flesh, okay? We all know in the 5th chapter of Galatians, it talks about the flesh is always warring against the spirit, and the spirit is always contrary to the flesh. And until we go home to be with Jesus, we're not immune from that battle that can rage on a daily basis. That's why in the 6th chapter of Ephesians, we're told to put on the full armor of God and take your stand, because we are in a battle. And there's no scripture that I've found to date that ever says you can take off the armor. So that battle rages on, and I'm here to tell you one of the major fronts of that battle that the devil thinks he's going to get every single one of us, that battle front is your brain. Okay? So understand, we threw out the concept of the soul being the emotions, the will, the thought. It's that juncture or that connection between the spirit. Again, these things are very deep and hard to explain, and us doing it simply like this doesn't do us justice, but just try to have a working knowledge of it. We have this soul that's linking the spirit to this world through the body. And the weak link is the body. In other words, the mind is linked and interacts to the outside world through the brain. And so a great deal of this war is in your brain. You all know marketing and advertising spends a lot of money trying to figure out how they can control your brain, even to the extent of things like subliminal advertising, putting a little unseen picture in the middle of something, you watch it innocently, and then all of a sudden, I got to have that candy bar. And so this sort of battlefront, this is nothing new. We all know about it, but unfortunately, we don't pay any attention to it. And since we're not paying any attention to it, some of us are having our butts handed to us on a regular basis, and we say, why? Well, because you're not lined up, focused on the battlefront, okay? And this issue of neuroadaptation and cellular memory, mark my words, in the years to come. Now, I hope Jesus comes back and makes this all a moot point real soon, you see. But let's say, for example, he doesn't, and this goes on for a while. In the years to come, as we learn more about addiction, okay, as we learn, as science and medical research tells us more, we are going to have these issues be a huge barrier that we're going to break, and new things are going to be learned and new things are going to be employed. For example, there may be medications or techniques such as neurofeedback or hypnosis. Who knows what they're going to come up with? I don't know. This world is crazy. And they're going to try to aim those new advantages to treat addiction to these areas. Can I have the next slide? All right, now I'm not going to hit you hard with a lot of neuroanatomy, but just know this right out before I get going. This stuff is complex, and what we're learning now in medicine is really only the surface of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, okay? And so I'm going to give you a very basic understanding. I'll show you a little bit of... oh, you know what? I got a slide with a... Okay, we're going to have a problem in a minute, but whatever, no big deal. I'm going to show you just a basic working of where this issues of addiction kind of is birthed from, okay? And a lot of people call it the reward pathway. Some people call it the pleasure center. You really call it whatever you want, but long story short, back in the 1950s, they found a way to manipulate and put things in rats' brains and people's brains and not kill them. So they were doing this stuff. They were doing a lot of experimentation, and they found this little area in the area of the midbrain called the ventral tegmental area. Here we go. And the nucleus accumbens. Now, it's kind of a little closer. This isn't a great rendition of a drawing, but these things are a little closer. But these are the dopaminergic pathways that tell the body, that tells the brain, that tells you, man, that was great stuff. Let's get some more. I don't know nobody in here ever had that, but when you look back and you say, oh, that's what that was. Yeah, that's what that was, okay? Now, what happens here, and this is where addiction really pulls a fast one on you, it directly inhibits this area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex is also termed the executive center. It's that part of the brain that separates us from the animal species over there and makes us the human species over here. Now, this is a Christian group, so I'll try to be gentle to explain this, but you ever see two dogs come together who've never seen each other before? Now, don't answer this question. You know what they do when they first meet each other, right? Okay, now, this part of the brain tells us, man, that's just dead wrong. Wow. And what happens in addiction is this says, yeah, it says no over here. So everything that's trying to inhibit you, give you good rational decisions, good judgment, tell you, boy, we might lose our paycheck if we do that. We might lose our job if we do that. I may lose my wife if I do that. I may end up in jail if I do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This part of the brain, as addiction progresses, progressively gets more and more inhibited and turned off. That's why you see more criminogenic activity. In other words, someone says, boy, I'll never lie about my drinking and drugging, and then they're lying about my drinking. I'll never steal to support my drinking and drugging, and then they're stealing to support their drinking and drugging. I'll never use needles in my drinking and drugging, and then they're using needles. This is because over the course of the long run, the high says, you got to get more of that. This is the best thing since sliced bread, and we need more of that no matter what. And over the course of time, this has a bigger hold on you, and any sensibility, rationality, or reasonability gets flushed down the toilet. And this is why people start doing more and more aggressively negative things with long-term addiction. In fact, in the 1950s, they did some things, and I don't, just so you know, I don't advocate this stuff, but it was done, heck, in the 1950s. I wasn't even around, so, you know, don't blame me. But they did these types of things, okay? They did these things on rats, and they found these areas, and they put these electrodes in them, and then they glued the skull shut, and then they let these rats go about their business with these little things sticking out of the head. They must have been pretty attractive. And then they taught the rats to do different stuff, and they experimented on their behavior. And they were able to train a rat to press a lever for food, to press a lever for water. Okay? And then they were able also to train a rat to put an electrical impulse down that little wire sticking outside of the head that happened to be right there. Now, a rat would do some very interesting thing when you make them touch that button. The first thing that you would notice is that rat would go over to that one bar, and push that electric stimulus through that wire into the pleasure center over and over and over, and that rat, despite feeling hungry, despite being dehydrated and thirsty, wouldn't even care anymore about the water and the food levers, and would push that dang pleasure center bar until it dropped dead. So you can see how powerful, even as the body of the rat would say, man, you got to live. You got to give that thing a break, bro. You're going to go blind. Go over here into the water thing over here. Come on now. It still would not be able to stop. The other thing this was kind of cruel, but I thought it was very interesting. You could, again, train the rat, or the whole thing we just said, but between, boy, they come up with some good stuff. Between the lever, where you could press the lever to get that electrical stimulus, and where the rat was sitting, they put electricity, like hurtful electricity that you would see going through electric fences. You know, when you touch it, blah, blah, blah. Well, they would electrify the grid that the rat would have to walk on in order to get to that lever. And that rat, it didn't matter how high you turn that juice up, even with smoke coming out of the feet, that rat would go over to touch that lever for the stimulation of the pleasure center. But that same rat would not cross the electrified grid to get to the lever for food or water. So you know what that means. That pleasure center stimulation became the most important dominating force in that rat's life. And that's exactly what we see in humans as addiction gets deeper and deeper. The addiction becomes the absolute most important thing in life. Give me the next slide. I think this is the one that's messed up. No, that's not the one that's messed up. It's the next one. This is a very important, strong, I put this in here because it makes me look smart. It's a big, long word, and I need all the help I can get in that department, so believe me, I'm not adverse to throwing these in there. This hypofrontality basically talks about that thing I mentioned in the prefrontal cortex. In a normal human being, this is a very active part of the brain. It's telling us, okay, do I do this? Should I do this? Should I wait? Should I blah? It's given us all the rationality. It makes us be civilized human beings. It's constantly keeping our desires in balance with what's appropriate for our actions. It's a very important part of the brain. However, once you start getting into this addiction, remember I told you the pleasure center, which of course you see this is much more active down here compared to the normal, this is directly inhibiting the prefrontal cortex. So in chronic drug abuse or alcohol abuse, you'll see a continuous decrease in the amount of activity in that prefrontal cortex, and the term given to it is hypofrontality. And as I said before, this is direct inhibition. In other words, the pathways here go over and turn this off, and it's through the dopamine pathways. So can I have the next? Yeah, there's two you can probably see this a little bit. There's two pictures. There's one picture behind there and this picture here, and they're supposed to, you can tell by all the words here it's messed up, they're supposed to transition out, but they're not here, so I won't talk much about this. All this slide was supposed to do, these two pictures were supposed to show us that there's significant neurological complexity when you're studying the brain and the effects of the brain on addiction, okay? There's not just, I gave you the prefrontal cortex, and I gave you the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, okay? But there's a lot more involved. Remember I told you I was going to give you a simplistic view, but there's other very important areas. There's the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory formation, okay? You talk to people with addiction, and sometimes they hear a specific song, they have a specific smell, they drive by a specific neighborhood, and it triggers a memory, and then all of a sudden they get this instantaneous craving. Well, the reason is because included in all these connections, because of this neuroadaptation, okay, these different parts of the brain become very sensitive to the addiction behaviors, addiction triggers, addiction emotions, addiction memories, and all this stuff starts to get more and more about the addiction. There's also a thing in here called the amygdala, and it's this nucleus in the midbrain that's responsible for emotional motivation. Remember we talked about in the early morning class that emotional volatility, okay, was a very prevalent reality in addiction. Well, what happens is that it becomes a motivating force in the brain. So in other words, not only is the pleasure center telling us this is the greatest thing we've ever had, let's get some more, the amygdala is saying, yeah, now get excited about it. It's like the coach or the cheerleader saying, yeah, more, and turns this whole thing into a crazy thing going on. And then there's other parts of the brain. In fact, there's pathways, and this doesn't work anymore, the battery's dead, in the cortex all around the upper outer area to where there's a lot of connections that are linking thoughts, sounds, smells, all sorts of other cues to the addiction phenomenon. And what this does is basically make the brain highly attuned to party. And if you've dealt with addiction people, you know it doesn't take a whole lot of influence or stimulus to get someone to start putting it down. You know what I mean? And this is why, because the brain, through neuroadaptation, slowly but surely moves towards addiction, 24/7. Wake up or come to, addiction. The drink, the drug. All day long, all the waking hours, the drink, the drug becomes the predominant force in that person's life. And it happens almost without the person's recognition. It's just happened. It becomes who they are because of these processes. Okay, next slide, please.